Welcome to Lady Mythos, or welcome back. Tonight, we travel into the old world of Persia, into a story carried through firelight, memory, and something quieter, something heavier. A story about a hero who could not be defeated by beasts, who crossed lands no one else would enter, who faced things most men would not even name. And yet, there is a question that lingers over every telling of his life. Not how strong he was, not how many battles he won, but something far simpler. Was he ever meant to survive? Any of it? Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. You can close your eyes and let the story form on its own, or follow the images as they appear, and move deeper into the world that once held his name. And if you find yourself here, listening from somewhere in the world tonight, I'd like to know where. Drop it in the comments. And if you enjoy these journeys, don't forget to like and subscribe to Lady Mythos, so we can walk through the next story together. Now, there are some names in history that belong to men, and there are others that feel like they belong to something else entirely. Rostam was one of those names. Chapter 1. Rostam, the hero who was never meant to survive. Before Rostam ever faced a demon, before kings called for him, before entire lands waited for his return, there were already signs that something about his life would not follow the path of other men. Not because he would fail, but because he would go further than anyone was meant to. In the old Persian epics, there are stories of guidance that comes from beyond the reach of men, of something ancient, watching from a distance, intervening only when the world begins to break. You may remember it. A vast presence, older than memory, one that once lifted a child from abandonment and returned him to the world changed. We've walked that path before, and in some quiet way, that presence never fully leaves this story. Because Rostam was not just born into strength. He was born into something that had already touched his bloodline. Something that does not announce itself, something that does not stay, but something that watches. And when the time came, when a king fell into darkness, when an entire kingdom began to lose its ground, it was not just a hero who stepped forward. It was someone already moving toward a path that others would never return from. There were two roads placed before him. One was known, one was safer, and one was spoken of in a different way. Not as a journey, but as a test that ends men. Rostam chose that road. Not because he did not understand the danger, but because something in him had never been meant to choose the easier path. And this is where his story truly begins. Not with victory, not with battle, but with a decision to walk into something that had already taken kings and left nothing behind. Because the 7 labors of Rostam were never just trials of strength. They were something else. Something that strips away certainty, one step at a time. And the deeper he went, the less this journey felt like a rescue. And the more it began to feel like something waiting for him. Something patient. Something inevitable. And by the time he understood what that meant, he was already too far in to turn back. Let's begin. Chapter 2. The Child of the Simurgh. Rostam's origin. Rostam's story does not begin with him. It begins higher, far from cities, far from courts, in a place where the air thins and the world feels distant, as if it belongs to something older than men. Before Rostam, there was his father, Zal. He was not welcomed when he was born. His hair was white, not with age, but from the moment he opened his eyes. And in a world that watched for signs, difference was not ignored. It was feared. So he was taken and left behind, high in the mountains, left where no child was meant to survive. But that was not the end of his story, because something heard him. Not a man, not a king, something older, something that does not belong to the ordinary world. You may remember it. We've walked its story before. A vast presence, wings wide enough to darken stone, watching from a place where time moves differently. The Simurgh. It did not descend like a storm. It did not strike or claim. It came down slowly, deliberately, and it chose to care. Zal was lifted from the cold stone and carried somewhere no human child had ever lived. High above the world, where silence stretches and everything below feels small. And there, he was raised, not as something abandoned, but as something kept. Time passed differently in that place, not measured in days, but in distance, in stillness, in watching. And when the moment came, when Zal was returned to the world of men, he did not return empty. He carried something with him. Not strength, not power. Something quieter. Something that waits until it is needed. A single feather. A promise. And years later, when his own life reached a moment that could not be solved by strength, that promise was called. Because when Rostam was to be born, the world did not welcome him gently. His mother suffered. The kind of suffering that does not ease. The kind that does not end with patience or time. And for the first time, Zal faced something he could not fight. So he turned, not to warriors, not to kings, but to what had once saved him. The feather burned, and it answered. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with presence. Immediate, certain. And what followed was not a miracle in the way stories often tell it. It was something more precise. Guidance. Knowledge given exactly when it was needed. And because of that, two lives were not lost that day. Rostam was born, but not quietly, not gently. From the beginning, there was something about him that did not fit the shape of an ordinary life. He grew quickly, faster than others, stronger than anyone expected. As a child, he did not test limits. He broke them. There are stories of beasts that should not have been faced, brought down by hands that had barely reached adulthood. And yet, even then, it was not just strength that people noticed. It was something harder to explain. A feeling. The Rostam was not moving through life the way other men did, as if the path ahead of him was already set, as if something had already decided how far he would go, and how far he would be allowed to return from. Because in stories like this, strength is never the whole answer. Sometimes it is only the beginning. And when the call finally came, when kings began to fall and the world shifted into something darker, Rostam did not hesitate. Because for someone like him, there was never going to be another path. And somewhere, far beyond sight, something that had once watched over his father remained exactly where it had always been. Watching, waiting, and saying nothing. And far from him, a king was already falling into darkness, and the world was beginning to change. Chapter 3. A king blinded, a kingdom falls. Far from the mountains, far from the quiet places where Rostam grew into his strength, there was a king who believed he could not be brought down. Kavus. He was not a weak ruler, not careless, but like many kings before him and many after, he believed that power meant reach. And there are places in this world that do not answer to kings. Mazandaran was one of them. It was not simply a distant land, it was spoken of differently, not as a place to conquer, but as a place where things do not follow the rules of men. There were warnings, quiet ones, the kind that are easy to ignore when everything in your life has always moved forward. But Kavus did not turn back. He gathered his army. He crossed into that land, and for a time, it must have felt like any other campaign. Until it didn't. Because Mazandaran did not resist the way kingdoms do. There were no walls to break, no armies waiting in formation. Only silence. And then, something unseen. The darkness did not fall all at once. It moved slowly, deliberately. Men began to lose their sight, not wounded, not struck, just gone. The world around them swallowed. And when it reached the king, there was nothing he could do. Kavus was blinded. Not by a blade, not by fire, but by something that did not need either. His army collapsed without a fight, not defeated, not scattered, held, trapped in a place where nothing could be seen and nothing could be understood. And in that silence, Mazandaran revealed what it truly was. Not a land to conquer, a place that waits. Back in Persia, the world began to shift. A kingdom does not fall all at once. It happens in smaller ways first. Messages stop arriving. Voices go quiet. The certainty that once held everything together begins to loosen. And then the truth reaches the surface. The king is gone. Not dead, not returned. Lost. And with him, the strength of the kingdom. There are moments in every story when people look around and realize no one knows what to do. This was one of them, because this was not a war. There was no enemy to face, no army to send, no strategy to rely on. Only a single understanding, shared quietly and without argument. No one who entered Mazandaran had ever returned. And yet, someone would have to go. Not as a king, not as an army, but alone. Because this was not something strength alone could solve. It required something else. And there was only one name that did not need to be spoken twice. Rostam. The message reached him, not as a command, but as something heavier, a need. By then, he was no longer a boy. His strength was known, his presence recognized. But this was different. This was not a test. This was a road that had already taken a king. And when it was placed before him, there was no moment of hesitation. Not because he did not understand the risk, but because somewhere, long before this moment, that choice had already been made. He prepared to leave, and before him, two paths were spoken of. One longer, safer, the other short, and known for something else. Not distance, but what waits along it. Most men would have chosen time, distance. Rostam did not, because for someone like him, the path was never about survival. It was about reaching the end, no matter what stood in the way. And so, without army, without hesitation, he stepped onto the road that others did not return from. And somewhere behind him, the world he knew began to fall silent. And ahead of him, something had already begun to move, slowly, waiting for him to come closer. Chapter 4. The First Trial. The Night of the Lion. The road into Mazandaran did not begin with noise, no battle, no warning. It began quietly. The kind of quiet that stretches too far, where even the wind seems to hold itself back. Rostam travelled alone, not with soldiers, not with banners, only with one companion, Raksh, a horse in name, but not in presence. There are creatures that follow, and there are those that choose. Raksh had never been led, never broken. He had stood his ground against beasts that would send others running. And when he carried Rostam, it was not out of obedience. It was understanding. Through open land across shifting ground, they moved without interruption. And for a time, nothing came for them. No sign of Mazandaran, no shadow, no resistance. Only distance, until night arrived. It did not fall suddenly. It settled, slow and complete. Rostam made no fire, no signal. He lay down against the earth as though rest was just another part of the journey. And for the first time since he had left, he closed his eyes. Raksh did not. There are moments when the world shifts and only those who are watching notice. It began with movement, subtle, low against the ground. Not the sound of wind, not something distant, something closer. The kind of presence that does not rush, it circles. A lion, drawn not by hunger alone, but by opportunity. Because even in a world of monsters, there are still rules that hold. And one of them is simple. When something powerful lowers its guard, something else will come. Rostam did not stir. The lion moved closer, step by step, measured, certain. Its eyes fixed, its body low, waiting for the moment when strength becomes stillness. And still, Rostam slept. But Raksh did not move away. He stepped forward, not in panic, not in fear, but with something else. A decision. The lion lunged, and in that instant, the silence broke. Not with a cry, not with chaos, with force. Raksh met it head on. The impact was sudden, violent, close. There was no distance between them, no space to retreat, only instinct. Claws struck, teeth answered, but Raksh did not give ground. He struck back with weight, with precision, with something that did not belong to prey. The lion faltered, just once, and that was enough. When Rostam woke, it was already over. The night had returned to stillness, the threat gone. And Raksh stood there breathing steady, as if nothing had been taken from him at all. For a moment, Rostam said nothing. He looked at the ground, at what remained, then back at Raksh. There was no praise, no command, because some things do not need to be spoken. He understood. This journey was not his alone, and the first trial had already come, not while he was fighting, not while he was ready, but while he slept. And it had been answered without him. He rose. The road still ahead, unchanged, but something beneath it had shifted. Because this was the first sign that the dangers of this path would not wait for him to face them, and that even he could not meet all of them alone. He continued forward, and the night closed behind him as if it had never opened at all. Chapter 5. The Second Trial. The Desert of Endings. By morning, the road had already changed. The ground grew harder, the air thinner. What little life had followed them began to fall away. No trees, no movement, no sound, only heat. It did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, pressing into the air, settling into the ground, rising again with every step they took. Rostam said nothing. He did not turn back, but even strength has limits. The body understands before the mind accepts them. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the world began to empty. The horizon stretched further than it should. The distance between one step and the next felt longer. Raksh slowed, not from weakness, but from knowing. There are places where even the strongest creature can feel what is coming before it arrives. The water they carried was gone before the sun reached its height. Rostam did not stop, at first, but the body changes, quietly. The breath shortens. The weight of armor becomes something else. Not protection. Burden. The air itself seemed to resist him, each step pressing down harder than the last. Still, he moved forward, because turning back was never a path he had learned to take. The hours passed, or something like them. Time no longer held its shape. There was only heat and distance. Raksh stumbled, just once, but it was enough. Rostam stopped, not because he chose to, because something in him would not move further. He looked out across the land. Nothing. No shadow. No break. No sign that this place would ever end. And for the first time since he had begun this journey, there was no enemy to face, no blade to raise, no strength to measure. Only a silence that does not fight back. And that is what makes it dangerous. He stepped forward again, once, twice, and then he fell. Not violently, not suddenly, just down. The kind of fall that does not come from impact, but from absence. The strength that had carried him simply not there. Raksh moved closer. Not with urgency, not with fear, but with something quieter. He stood beside him, waiting. The sun did not move, or if it did, it made no difference. The world remained exactly as it was, unchanged. And for a moment it felt as though this was how the journey would end. Not in battle, not in struggle, but here, unseen, unchallenged, forgotten. And then something shifted. Not in the ground, not in the sky, something small. A movement at the edge of sight. Raksh lifted his head. He saw it first. A shape, low to the ground, moving with purpose, not wandering, not searching, leading. A ram. It did not run. It did not hesitate. It moved forward, as if the path had already been chosen. Raksh followed, slowly, then with certainty. And after a moment, Rostam stirred. Not fully, not with strength, but enough. Enough to rise, enough to follow. Step by step they moved after it. No sound, no call, only direction. The land did not change immediately, but something in the air began to shift. The weight lessened, the distance shortened. And then, without warning, water. Not imagined, not distant, real. Cutting through the ground like something that had always been there, waiting. Raksh reached it first, then Rostam. The world returned slowly, not all at once. Breath came back, strength followed, and the silence that had nearly taken everything began to loosen its hold. When Rostam finally lifted his head, the ram was gone. No trace, no sound, as if it had never been there at all. For a long moment he said nothing. He looked at the water, then at the path ahead, and somewhere beneath the surface of that silence, a question began to form. This road was not empty. Something had seen him fall, and chosen not to let him remain there. But not everything that watches does so to protect. He rose. The strength returned to him, but not unchanged, because now the journey carried something new. Not just danger, but awareness. That he was no longer moving through this path alone. And as he stepped forward once more, the desert remained behind him, but not forgotten. Because some places do not follow you. They wait. And the deeper he went, the clearer it became. This was only the beginning of what that road would take from him. Chapter 6. The Third Trial. The Hidden Dragon. The desert did not follow them, but something else did. Not in form, not in sound, in pattern. The kind that does not reveal itself until it has already begun. The land changed again. The heat gave way to stone. Dark ground, uneven, broken in places that forced each step to be chosen. No wind, no movement, only stillness. The kind that feels held. Rostam moved forward without slowing. The strength had returned to him, his breath steady again. But something had shifted. Not in his body, in the space around him. Raksh felt it first. There are moments when an animal knows before the world decides to show it. His steps grew sharper. His head lifted more often. He was watching. For something Rostam could not yet see. Night came. Slowly. Not with relief, not with calm, but with weight. The kind that settles into the ground and does not lift. Rostam stopped. He had walked far enough. The road ahead unchanged, the silence unbroken. There was no sign of danger, and so he rested. Raksh did not. He circled once, then again. The ground beneath them felt wrong, not unstable, too still. Rostam lay back against the stone, his hand resting near his weapon, but even that loosened as sleep took hold. And once again, the moment came. It did not announce itself. It did not move across the land. It rose from beneath, a shape unfolding from the darkness itself. Long, heavy, silent. The kind of creature that does not hunt by speed, but by certainty. A dragon. Its body coiled through the ground, as if it had always been there. Its eyes fixed, not on movement, on stillness. And the one moment when even the strongest becomes unaware. Raksh saw it. He stepped forward, sharp, immediate. He struck the ground, once, twice, hard enough to break the silence. Rostam stirred. His eyes opened. He reached for his weapon, looked out into the dark. Nothing. The ground was empty, still, unchanged. Raksh did not move. His body held tension, his gaze fixed. But Rostam saw nothing. After a moment, he exhaled and lay back down. Sleep returned. The silence settled again. And beneath it, the shape returned. Closer this time. The ground shifted, almost imperceptibly. The dragon rising once more. Patient. Waiting. Raksh moved again. More force this time. He struck the earth harder, pushed closer to Rostam, demanding. This time, Rostam woke faster, his hand already on his weapon. He rose, looked again. Still nothing. Only darkness, only stone, the same empty land. His breath slowed. And something else replaced it. Irritation, confusion. The kind that comes when something does not make sense. He looked at Raksh. For a moment, neither moved. Then slowly, he lowered himself again. The silence returned, but now it felt different. Tighter, watching. And for the third time, it came. No hesitation now. The dragon rose fully, its form breaking through the illusion of stillness. Its body vast, coiled, undeniable. Rakesh did not wait. He moved with force, struck again. And this time, Rostam did not question it. He rose instantly, his blade drawn. And now he saw it. Not as a shadow, not as a suggestion, but as something real. Something that had been there all along. The dragon lunged, fast, closer than it should have been, its body cutting through the air, with weight, with certainty. But Rostam met it, not with hesitation, with force. The clash was immediate, steel against scale, movement against mass. The ground itself seemed to shift beneath them. Raksh struck from the side, holding it just long enough for Rostam to step in. One movement, precise, final. The blade found its mark, and the creature stilled. Not slowly, at once. The silence returned, but not the same silence. This one, broken. Rostam stood over it, breathing steady, unshaken, but not unchanged. He looked at Raksh, and this time there was no question, only understanding. Because the danger had not come once. It had come again and again. And each time he had almost missed it. Not from weakness, but from something else, something more dangerous. The belief that he would always see what was coming. He turned back to the road, the path ahead, still waiting. But now he walked it differently, more aware, more watchful. Because this land did not always reveal its dangers, until the moment they chose to be seen. And somewhere ahead, something else was already waiting. Not hidden, not silent, but wearing a different face entirely. Chapter 7. The fourth and fifth trials. The sorceress and the trap. The land did not warn him this time. No shifting ground, no silence stretched too far. Instead, it softened. The stone beneath his steps gave way to earth that did not resist. The air cooled, not sharply, not suddenly, just enough to be noticed. After distance and heat and darkness, that change feels like relief. And that is where the danger begins. Rostam slowed, not from caution, from recognition, because something in this place felt almost familiar. Not safe, but close enough that the mind does not push it away. Ahead, there was an opening, not built, not shaped by hands, but formed, as if the land itself had chosen to make space. A clearing, and within it, someone waiting. A woman. She did not move when he approached. She did not turn as though she had just noticed him. She was already facing him, already aware. There are moments when something feels wrong, but not enough to name. This was one of them. Raksh stopped, not abruptly, but enough. His body held still, not tense, alert, watching, without sound. Rostam continued forward. The woman spoke. Her voice was calm, even, but there was something in it that did not change. No shift, no reaction. As if it had been spoken before, as if it had always been waiting to be said. She offered him rest, food, water. No hesitation, no question of who he was or how he had come to this place. And for a moment, after everything he had crossed, it felt simple. Rostam stepped closer, not careless, but not resisting, because nothing in her presence demanded it. She moved then, only slightly, enough to place something before him. The motion was smooth, too smooth. Not wrong, but without variation. As if it did not belong to effort. Raksh did not move. His eyes remained fixed. Not on her face. Lower, following something that did not match the rest. Rostam sat. The ground was cool, the air still. The kind of stillness that does not settle. It holds. She placed the food before him. Close, within reach. And for a moment, nothing else existed. No desert, no dragon, no path ahead. Only this. Rest. Rostam reached forward, and then stopped. Not from fear, not from doubt. Something else. A pause that did not come from thought. From recognition. The kind that does not form into words, but does not leave. He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment something did not align. Not her face, not her form. Something beneath it. Still. Too still. He spoke, quietly. A single word, not directed at her, spoken into the space between them. And that was enough. The air changed. Not violently, not suddenly. It tightened. The stillness broke, and her form did not hold. At first, it was small, a shift in the edge of her shape, a delay where there should have been movement. Then more, the image pulling against itself as if it had been stretched too far. And beneath it, something else began to surface. Not human, not whole. The woman did not disappear. She revealed. Layer by layer, the shape gave way, until what stood before him no longer resembled what it had offered. A sorceress. Not hidden in darkness, hidden in something more dangerous. Trust. She moved, fast now, without restraint, because there was nothing left to maintain. But Rostam was already standing, the blade drawn, the distance between them gone. This time, there was no illusion to protect her, no softness, no stillness, only what she was. The strike came quickly and ended just as fast, because deception, once broken, has little strength left to stand on. When it was done, the clearing shifted again. The light faded, not into darkness, into absence. The air lost its stillness, the ground its calm, as if none of it had ever existed at all. Rostam stood there, not in surprise, but in quiet understanding, because now the path had shown him something new. Not every danger comes with force. Some arrive offering something back. He turned and continued forward. But the road did not return to silence. It changed again, not into illusion, into resistance. Movement appeared ahead, not hidden, waiting. Men. They did not rush him. They watched, measured, as if they had been expecting this moment and nothing else. Then they moved. The clash was brief, not because they lacked strength, but because that was never their purpose. They were not meant to defeat him, only to stop him. And for a moment, they did. Numbers can do what strength cannot. Rostam was held, not defeated, but contained. And with that, the path shifted again, because now he was no longer walking it freely. He was being taken deeper, toward something that did not hide, something that did not need deception. Among them, one stood differently, not stronger, not louder, but aware. His name was Olad, and he knew this place, not as a visitor, as something that had survived it. Rostam saw it immediately, and when the moment came, he did not hesitate. The struggle broke, not through force alone, but through precision. Olad was taken, not as an enemy, as something else. A guide. Because now, the path ahead had a shape, a direction, a center. Mazandaran was no longer just a place. It was something with a heart, and something waiting inside it. Rostam released the others, but not Olad, because some knowledge cannot be left behind. And as they moved forward together, the air changed once more. Less illusion, less silence, more presence, more weight. Because now, he was no longer approaching this place. He was inside it. And whatever waited ahead was no longer hiding. It was ready. Chapter 8. The 6th and 7th Trials. The Demons. The land did not resist them anymore. It accepted them, not as guests, as something expected. The deeper they moved, the less the world resembled anything Rostam had known. The ground darkened, not with shadow, with something that held it. The air felt thicker, harder to move through, as if each step forward was being measured. Olad walked ahead, not leading with confidence, but with certainty. He did not need to search for the path. He already knew where it ended. And that knowledge did not bring him comfort. They passed no villages, no signs of life, only remnants, broken ground, shattered forms, the kind of place where something had already happened and nothing had returned to rebuild it. Then, they reached it. Not a fortress, not a city. A place carved into the land itself. Low, wide, and silent. Olad stopped. For the first time since they had begun walking together, he did not move forward. This is where it waits. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Rostam stepped past him. There was no hesitation. There never had been. Inside, the darkness was not complete. It shifted, moved in ways that did not belong to light, and within it, something else was already present. Not hidden, not watching, waiting. The first to rise was not the one he had come for. A figure stepped forward, massive, built not like a man, but like something shaped for impact. Arzang Div. Not subtle, not deceptive. Force in its simplest form. It did not speak. It moved. The ground broke beneath it, and in a moment, the space between them was gone. Rostam met it. No delay, no distance. The clash struck hard enough to shake the silence itself. This was not like the battles before. There was no pattern to learn, no illusion to break. Only weight, force against force. Arzang struck again, and this time, Rostam did not step back. He stepped in, closer, where strength becomes decisive. The movement was quick, precise, and final. The body fell, heavy, unmoving, and for a moment, nothing followed. The space held still, as if the land itself had paused. Then it changed. Deeper within the darkness, something shifted. Not rising, unfolding. Slow. Certain. Larger than the space it occupied, as if the cave itself had to give way around it. The white demon. It did not rush. It did not strike. It watched. And that was worse. Because this was not something reacting to him. This was something that had already decided. Rostam stepped forward. There was no other direction left. The demon moved, and the clash came without warning, faster than it should have been. The force of it drove through him. Not enough to break him, but enough to shift him back. Just once. And that had never happened before. The ground caught beneath his feet, but for a moment he did not move forward. Not immediately. The demon struck again, heavy, relentless, not wild, precise. Each movement carrying weight that did not fade. Raksh lunged, pulling its focus, but even that did not stop it. For a moment, the rhythm did not belong to Rostam. The ground gave way beneath them. Stone cracked. The air filled with impact. Too fast, too close. And then, stillness. Not silence. A pause, small, but enough. Rostam stood, just outside its reach, breath steady. But something had changed. Not in his strength, in his understanding. Because this was not something that would fall to force alone. And for the first time since the trials began, he did not move immediately. He waited. The demon watched. And in that space between them, something shifted. Not in the land, in the moment. Because this was the point where the outcome could turn. The demon moved first, and this time, Rostam did not meet it head-on. He stepped aside, not away, through, closer, past the weight of the strike, into the space it left behind. For a fraction of a moment, the demon overextended. Just enough. Rostam moved, not fast, precise. The blade struck, once, and the resistance held, for a breath, long enough to feel it, to know this was not yet finished. The demon turned, faster now, closing the space again, and this time, Rostam did not retreat. He stepped in again, closer than before, where there is no room left for hesitation. The second strike came, deeper, decisive, and this time, something gave. The force broke, not gradually, all at once. The demon staggered, and in that moment, Rostam did not hesitate. The final strike landed, clean, irreversible. The white demon fell. The impact echoed through the space, then faded. And what remained was not silence. Release. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, Rostam stepped forward. Because this had never only been about victory. Deeper within, the king remained, blind, held in a darkness that had not lifted. Rostam knelt beside him, and what had been taken was not returned through strength, but through something else. From the fallen creature, he took what remained, not as a trophy, as something needed. And when it was done, the darkness lifted. Not from the land, but from the king. Sight returned slowly, as if the world itself had to be remembered. The hold of Mazandaran broke, not completely, but enough. Enough for the living to leave, enough for the path to open. Rostam rose, the trials behind him, the king restored, the purpose fulfilled. But the silence did not fully lift, because even in victory, something remained. Not seen, not spoken, but carried. And as he turned to leave that place, the land did not follow, but it did not forget. and neither did he. Chapter 9. The Victory That Changed Everything. They did not leave Mazandaran the way they entered it. There was no uncertainty now, no searching. The path opened, not welcoming, but clear. The land that had resisted them, that had hidden, shifted, and tested, now allowed them to pass. Rostam rode ahead, Raksh steady beneath him. Behind them, the place remained, unchanged, as if nothing that had happened within it had ever truly disturbed it at all. The king followed, not as he had entered, not blinded, not broken, but quieter. There are things that do not leave a mark on the body, but remain somewhere else. The journey back was shorter, or perhaps it only felt that way, because the weight had changed. They were no longer moving towards something unknown, they were returning. And yet, something in the air did not feel resolved, not entirely. The silence that had followed Rostam through the trials did not disappear. It settled, stayed close, as if the path had not fully released him. When they crossed beyond Mazandaran, the world shifted again. The air lightened, the ground softened. Life returned in small ways first. Movement, sound, the presence of things that did not need to hide. And still, Rostam did not slow. He did not look back. Because some places are not meant to be carried with you, and some memories do not need to be revisited. When they reached Persia, the change was immediate. The absence that had begun to spread lifted. The king had returned, and with him, certainty. The people gathered, not in celebration at first, but in recognition, because what had been lost had not been expected to return. And yet, there he stood, restored, alive, and behind him, the one who had walked into that place and come back. Rostam. There are moments when a name becomes something else. Not just a man, but a certainty. A force that others begin to rely on without question. This was one of those moments. The king spoke. Gratitude, given without hesitation. The kingdom restored. And for a time, everything held, as it should, as it was meant to. But Rostam did not remain in that moment. He did not stand in it the way others did, because something in him had already moved past it. Victory had never been the end of the path, only a point along it. And now that the trials were behind him, something else had taken their place. Not danger, not uncertainty. Something quieter, harder to name. A weight that did not come from battle, but from knowing that the road he had walked had not been the only one waiting. That what he had faced was not the only thing the world would ask of him. Rakesh stood beside him, unmoving, as if he felt it too. That this was not an ending, only a pause. And in that pause, there was no fear, no doubt, only something else. the sense that what comes after victory is not always lighter. Sometimes it is where the story truly begins to change. And though nothing more was asked of him that day, the path had not finished with him. Not yet. Epilogue. Rostam. The fight he could not win. Stories remember Rostam for what he overcame, the strength, the battles, the path that no one else could walk. And those things are not forgotten. They are told again and again as proof of what a single man can endure. But there is something else that is spoken of more quietly, not in the same way, not with the same certainty, because it does not fit with the rest of his story. It does not rise like a victory. It does not end with return. It lingers. There came a time, long after the battles, long after the road through Mazandaran, when Rostam faced something that did not announce itself as an enemy. There was no warning, no sign that this moment would be different from the others. No reason to believe that anything stood before him that he could not overcome. Because until then, nothing ever had. But not all fights begin with recognition, and not all battles are meant to be won. What stood before him that day was not something he had prepared for, not something he had been shaped to face. And when the moment came, when strength and instinct and everything that had carried him this far rose to meet it, the outcome was not what the world expected. It was not what he expected. And it did not end the way his story had always ended before. Some say that was the moment his legend truly changed. Not when he defeated monsters, not when he walked into darkness and returned, but when he stood in a place where none of that was enough. And afterward, nothing carried the same weight. Because even the strongest are not protected from everything. Some paths are not meant to be seen until you are already standing in them. And some fights are not about strength at all. They are about something else, something quieter, something that does not reveal itself until it is already too late. Rostam survived what no one else could. But this was different. And if you listen closely to the stories that remain, you can still feel it there, not in the victories, but in the silence that follows them. A reminder that even legends carry moments they cannot outrun. And perhaps that is the part of his story that stays with us the longest. If you want to hear that story, the one that is not told as often, the one that changed everything for him, let me know, and we'll walk that path together. But for now, stay here just a little longer. Let the silence settle. Let the story rest where it found you. And if you felt something in it tonight, something that stayed with you, you can leave a quiet mark of it here. A like, a word, a place you're listening from. And if you want more journeys like this, you already know where to find me. Thank you for listening. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Sweet dreams. Yours, Lady Mythos.